Oh man, we got something pretty interesting going on here today. It isn't often I get to dive into the horribly convoluted garbage heap that is UFOlogy. Well, that's not entirely true. I'm pretty well versed. I grew up on science fiction. This is a completely different situation though, because I'm forced to actually look at this objectively. And well, it took me places. Some pretty interesting places. Possibly shocking places. And it ruined a lot of things for me along the way too. So in usual fashion, I'm gonna break this video up into parts. You guys know I can't just drop a 40+ minute video on you and not tell you what to expect. To really understand this batshit crazy story, I gotta cover a few key aspects first. We're also going to talk briefly about ufology and some of the key players surrounding old Bob here, and then we're going to finish it off with how our favorite galactic pimp fits into it all. Today's video is about the real life story of the world famous whistleblower Robert Scott Lazar, and the mystery surrounding his time at Area 51's S4 facility. So within the insane world of ufology, Robert, or as most know him as Bob, is the messiah of mainstream alien lore. Since 1990, there have been over 10 different documentaries on Bob and his story. He's been featured on the Sci-Fi Network, he's even been on the History Channel, he's done countless interviews, he just recently had another documentary released on him this year, and even an upcoming TV series as a continuation to his original story, which we will cover in-depthly. And last, as I'm writing the script, he actually landed a spot on the Joe Rogan podcast. I got some choice words for that show now. Anyway, as far as content creators go, I got it pretty easy. I have a surprisingly open-minded viewer base. A lot of you guys have seen just as much crazy shit as me. We've dealt with CIA mercenaries and top secret ops.
Non-negotiable.
We've seen staged footage portrayed as real events.
I don't know if you have a misconception of what's going on, but here's the deal.
We've dove to dark places to dig up old history. We've been there, we've done it. Today's video is the same, but vastly different in scale. See, not only are we diving into the great Bob Lazar and his insane story, but we're also going to be demystifying a lot of the misconceptions Pimp Daddy Lazar and his posse have managed to create and perpetrate over the years. See, there's two Bobs. Bob Lazar, the UFO messiah we've all come to love over the years, and then there's the real Bob. And I plan on introducing you to both today. We're setting the record straight. We're gonna make some friends, possibly some enemies. If you're new and stumbled over here from Secure Team or Rogan's podcast, welcome. Get ready though, because you're about to get your goddamn mind blown all over the wall. I'm about to put both those showings to shame. So with that said, I don't really care what side of the fence you're on in regards to the ET question. It's irrelevant in the end. I know that's weird because Bob's story is based around UFOs, but to actually understand this fully, we have to separate Bob from all that and look at him like he's any other dude, regardless of the sensational claims he's made, regardless of how many documentaries he's been in. Screw Netflix and screw Rogan. Their writers and researchers are dog shit. Forget all that, because today Bob is just one of us. He's nothing special. To really get to the bottom of the Bob Lazar mystery, we have to cover all the main players. I can't leave room for doubt in this one, guys. Robert Brothel Bandit Lazar and his cronies John Lear, Gene Huff, and George Knapp. 4 people who were some of the biggest to blame for this conundrum. First up is Gene Huff. He's a real estate agent who met Bob in the early to mid 80s. At the time, Bob and his wife Carol were running a photo processing business out of their home, and they prepared pictures for Gene's real estate business. They ended up becoming close friends. Interesting side note, Gene Huff at the time was also an amateur screenwriter. Next up is John Lear. Oh man, John Lear. So John is without a doubt an amazing pilot. He's flown over 150 types of different aircraft in over 50 different countries. The man's Top Gun incarnate, but he's also batshit crazy and loves attention. Just to give you a little example of what I mean, John Lear is so deep in conspiracy, he thinks that the sun revolves around the earth and that alien praying mantises work with the government in secrecy. Just look at this crazy old bastard. He's another one of Bob's close friends, and he was introduced to Bob through Gene in the mid 80s. They claim that they didn't meet till 88, but we'll get into that a little bit later on. I can't spoil everything at the beginning. The most reputable member of the group is George Knapp. He's an award-winning investigative journalist news anchor from Las Vegas. He was introduced to Bob in early 89 through John Lear. The exact dates widely vary depending on who you're asking or when you asked, a trend you'll notice a lot during this video. The kingpin in the center is good old Robert Scott Lazar. Totally real top secret physicist by day, super galactic pimp by night. It's a pretty convoluted story. I gotta give you a little heads up on what's to come. With that said, I'm gonna be giving you a spurgy, dramatic retelling of Bob's story. There may be small parts you haven't heard. Nowadays, Bob often forgets things.
This element 115 was the fuel.
Yeah, it was the fuel.
The world will forgive you for having a migraine. Can I just
It's really
say
hard to think through this. Just give me a minute.
We'll just give you more
I just
booze.
want to say one. Yeah, definitely.
So I have to use a lot of old footage from when he could remember. But rest assured, everything I tell you has been publicly stated by Bob or his advisors Gene, George, or more recently Jeremy. Bob has a notoriously terrible memory, guys. It's okay though, I got him. This is the official Bob Lazar mainstream tale. So the story of Bob Lazar started one fateful night, May 1989. George Knapp, a news anchor and investigative journalist, was approached by a man scared for his life. He was a physicist that was employed by the US government in a top secret program at Groom Lake. Dennis, the mysterious whistleblower, gave a brief description of what he had seen at the Groom Lake base and supplied us with an insight into the inner workings of the United States military.
A local scientist who says he worked at Groom Lake and saw the saucers joins us in tonight's interview. He has asked that his identity be shielded. Sir, how do we know you are who you say you are and that you actually have knowledge about what's going on at Groom Lake?
Well, I guess there's no way you could really know. There's really no way I can prove it without revealing my identity and getting myself into more trouble than I have already.
Exactly what's going on up there?
Well, there's several, actually 9 flying saucers, flying discs that are out there of extraterrestrial origin, and they're being test flown and basically just analyzed.
It was clear the whistleblower was concerned for his safety after coming forward. He had already had threats of espionage waved at him and his wife.
Yeah, I've been threatened with being charged with espionage. I've had my life threatened by them, my wife's life threatened by them, and I mean, I don't know where else you can go from there.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us. Pretty interesting stuff you've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
But even with the imminent danger, he felt the reward of coming forward was well worth the risk, and the scientific community as a whole needed to know about these discoveries. The mysterious man's claims were groundbreaking and set George Knapp on a new mission. His mission was to blow the top off of the secrecy surrounding Area 51. A few months would pass and then George was approached again by the same man, except now things are worse. Admittedly, after the Dennis interview, he was called and threatened by an anonymous person with military connections, and Bob went to update his ID and get a new birth certificate, but they couldn't find any of his information. Fearing what might happen, he once again confided in George. He told him everything, his credentials, his name, where he worked, and even how he was hired. Bob even had recorded evidence. A month earlier in March, Bob took his wife Tracy and a few of his friends like Gene Huff and John Lear to view the sightings. Bob knew the test flight schedule from his time at S4. Every Wednesday night, the military performed test flights of UFOs. So for 3 weeks in March and April, they visited the site and recorded what they seen. And on the third visit, they were apprehended by the US military and arrested in a restricted area. The next day, Bob was called into work. He had a gun put to his head and informed that the government was taping his phone lines. They'd been listening for months and knew exactly who he's been in contact with. To prove how serious they were, they slapped down transcripts of phone call conversations. And the phone transcripts wasn't from one of Bob's calls. It was a transcript of one of Tracy's calls. And to Bob's shock, she was having an affair.
At the time, I did tell my wife what was going on until later in, as things progressed, but she was having an affair with somebody on the phone line. And it was her flight instructor that I was paying for flying lessons, by the way. But as this was going on, just like in the astronaut program, not only do you have to have security as far as no connection to foreign governments or things like that, but as far as your family life, it has to be stable because they don't want any loose cannons running around. So this is going on, I had no knowledge of it.
With his life in danger and his marriage on the brinks, Bob confided in his close friends Gene and John. George Knapp was obviously taken back by all of this. But being a super serious investigative journalist he is, he went out and performed a thorough interview and background check on Bob himself to try to validate his claims. And his findings were troubling. He couldn't find any of Bob's college credentials. Digging deeper, he couldn't find any birth records either. There was very little information available about Bob Lazar, and people still had questions about Bob's time there. When was he there? How many days did he work? What else did he see? We need to know more about these UFOs and his roles in backward engineering them. There were resounding issues though. Some details were unclear to Bob, precise dates, what he did while he was there, almost like there was a mental block stopping him from recalling the events. Luckily for good old George Knapp, he had a solution to this problem: hypnosis. In August of '89, after a successful hypnosis session, Bob was able to recall many specific details that were once hiding away in the dark reaches of his mind. Details of his briefing started to come forth. Bob was hired to replace another scientist that died in a small yield nuclear blast while working on a UFO engine. The briefing also contained information on the spacecraft's origins and the beings who built it. It was those dirty greys from Zeta Reticuli. Sneaky bastards. George, knowing this information was huge, was still skeptical, and he knew others in the UFO community would be too. So he used his connections in Las Vegas to set up a polygraph test. 4 of them.
Before you toss Lazar on the pile with all the other UFO wackos, understand that he willingly agreed to take a lie detector test, requested and independently arranged by a Las Vegas reporter. Terry Tavernetti is the ex-cop who administered the test.
If he's lying, he ought to be in Hollywood, because he gave absolutely no physiological indications of attempting deception.
Bob passed 3 with ease, 1 not so much, but you can't win them all. Regardless, they felt they had enough information to make a real impact on the scientific community and proceeded to tape an interview for safekeeping. The secret facility that Bob was hired at to work was Area 51. He was in a separate facility off of Groom Lake called S4.
His employer was the United States Navy. He says he and other government employees would gather near EG&G, fly to Groom Lake, then a very few people would get into a bus with blacked out or no windows and drive to S4.
When you get off the bus, what do you see?
Very interesting building. It's got a slope of probably about 30 degrees, which are hangar doors.
He described it as a docking bay built into the side of a mountain. There were 9 hangar doors that were camouflaged to match the color and texture of the mountainside. George Knapp held on to the interview with Lazar until November of 1989, initially for safekeeping, but Bob and George came to the conclusion that since Bob's life was already in danger, they might as well take control of the situation and release Bob's interview to the public.
The power source is an antimatter reactor. They run gravity amplifiers. There's actually 2 parts to the drive mechanism. It's a bizarre technology. There's no physical hookup between any of the systems in there. They use gravity as a wave, using waveguides, almost like microwaves.
The idea behind this power play is that once Bob's whole story was out in the open, the government wouldn't dare touch him, because in the end that would only prove him right. It was a bold move, and when George released his interview with Lazar in November, during a UFO expo, it received massive attention. Worldwide attention. TV networks all over the world were airing his interview. Different news organizations were trying to sign him for exclusive contracts. People wanted to hear more. They needed to hear more. Others doubted him, and some even took it upon themselves to form their own investigation into Bob's radical story.
I did a lot of checking on him. I find a lot of things didn't check out. That doesn't mean I disagree with everything he ever said, or that he was a liar all the time. It means that I can't buy the story as presented.
Just keep that in the back of your mind, it's important for later on. As the new year approached, Bob and George and Jean decided the best way to put an end to all the confusion and solidify Bob's testimony within the scientific community would be to lay everything out. Regardless of the repercussions, they had to tell the public everything. So they began to work on the Lazar tape. But the effects were starting to show on Bob. His personal life started to fall apart. After his interviews in November and December, Bob and his wife Tracy's marriage succumbed to the pressure. Bob was a broken man. He had lost the best job he had ever had and got cucked by his wife's flight instructor. He was truly in a dark place. One fateful night, sometime in the early months of 1990, Bob met a woman named Tony in Las Vegas. She helped him forget about the pressures of the US military and his marriage ending in the shitter. They became close friends. Bob helped her with her business, and eventually she fell for his charm and wanted more. But Bob's one and only true love is science, so he had to keep it professional. What was her business, you ask? I'll give you a little hint. She had the esteemed title of Madame. Some would call her a prostitute. They prefer the term high-class escorts, you bigots. Either way, she sold her coochie for cash. Bob didn't judge though. He's a good man. He doesn't care about things like hookers and STDs. He's above that. He's a man of science. And he helped Tony turn her alleyway extravaganza into an actual business. Bob set up a computer system, surveillance cameras. In exchange, he got a cut of the cash, of course. But when George got wind of this, he knew it would be used falsely against Bob to slander him and discredit him. So George took it upon himself to set Bob on the right track again. And he himself turned Bob in.
He was helping them set up a little mini brothel in a neighborhood. And when he told me about it, I thought, oh my gosh, my professional life is flashing before my eyes here. The most high-profile witness and the biggest story I've ever done is now telling me he's involved in this criminal enterprise. He kind of thought it was funny, but it wasn't funny to me. So I said, you got to stop this stuff. You got to shut this down. I called the cops. I let some people know, look, he made a mistake. It's being shut down. They raided the place, arrested Bob,
June 5th, 1990, Bob and Tony's apartment brothel was raided and Bob was arrested. June 18th, Bob pled guilty to a felony charge of pandering in district court. According to him, he got to pick his charge and he settled on felony pandering. The courts also had trouble looking at Bob's schooling credentials, but Lazar stood firm on his claims. And in a surprising turn of events, in August, the courts only sentenced him to 6 months probation and community service. He was also ordered to undergo psychotherapy and ordered to stay away from brothels, but other than that, he was good to go. And now that the small brothel bump in the road is behind him, it was the perfect time for him, George, and Jean to sit down and finish the Lazar tape. And when they released it in 1991, it was a great success. At the time, it was the most highly purchased, bootlegged video in UFO history. There are 3 big revelations from the Lazar tape. The first came when Bob revealed the nature of the relationship between extraterrestrials and humans.
Any dates in the information regarding these beings were written in a 6-digit number which began with 1623. Since I had no idea what the 6-digit number was for the present year, I had no way of calculating when these beings arrived, or at least arrived this time. These beings said that they had been visiting Earth for a long time and presented photographic evidence which they contended was over 10,000 years old. There was an exchange of hardware and information in Central Nevada until 1979, at which time there was a conflict which brought the program to an abrupt halt. The beings left, but were to return at a 1623 date, and I don't know what that date is.
The next big reveal was based on the craft and the energy source, element 115.
The fact is that heavier stable elements with higher atomic numbers, which have more protons, neutrons, and electrons than any Earth elements, do exist. However, up until this point in history, there has been no physical evidence to prove this. But now that proof is here.
Many believe Bob was in fact the first person to mention it. The third interesting reveal was when Lazar elaborated on the process in which he went through to obtain his position at S4, and the role Edward Teller had in his hiring. In case this is your first time hearing about Edward Teller, I'll give you a brief description. Edward Teller was one of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project to make the first nuclear bombs.
While working at Los Alamos National Lab in 1982, the local newspaper did a front-page story on a jet car I had built. Coincidentally, Dr. Teller was giving a speech in Los Alamos that same day. We met and had a short chat about the jet car, and I later listened to his speech. I never met Dr. Teller again, but in 1988, when I decided to re-enter the scientific community, I sent him a resume and inquired about a job. Dr. Teller responded by telephone and told me that he was no longer active, but just functioned in a consultant capacity. He gave me the name of a contact to call in Las Vegas. I made that call, and things progressed from there until I got into the program. I never got a chance to ask Dr. Teller if he remembered me from Los Alamos, so I don't know if that was a factor or not.
Edward Teller is like a real-life Victor Von Doom and a gold mine for conspiracy theories. The Lazar tape production was a great success for all involved and cemented Bob within the alien lore itself. Many looked at him as the missing piece that connected it all together, and the believers vastly outweighed the doubters. The military also seemed to leave him alone and he was safe to carry on his own life. And he did. In the mid-90s, he opened up his own business called United Nuclear. He was able to live a comfortable life doing what he loves. Even though over the years Bob's story was featured on TV, he never really seemed to want to participate in the mainstream UFO community. He would only make sporadic brief appearances and often shied away from interviews and kept to himself. It seemed to all involved that the Bob Lazar story was at an end, and all the questions that would ever be answered have already been addressed. That is until a series of events took place years later that once again thrust Bob into the UFO spotlight. It seems the government never stopped watching him. His business United Nuclear was raided in 2003 in connection with a strange murder.
I'm going to ask one more question of our guest Bob Lazar, non-UFO related. Then we will take our break, get that out of the way, and bring on our other guests, Gene Huff and John Lear. Bob, the last time we had you on, it was not that long after you had an encounter with the government there in New Mexico about something you were selling online. And the reason it became national news is because this particular element was used apparently to kill a Russian spy. And so national news networks start asking questions about the element. I think it's polonium. And lo and behold, they find this guy in New Mexico who's selling it, right?
Yeah, they, I guess, not knowing very much about polonium-210, which was the isotope that was used, they went and Googled it. And if you, I don't know if it's still the case, but I bet it is. If you Google polonium-210, United Nuclear comes up, and probably our sales page with it right on there.
Even though he failed to pin it on Bob, they still sentenced him to 3 years probation for selling hazardous material, most likely to keep tabs on him. As we slide into more recent times, Bob once again starts to wonder if he's in the clear. He's older now, he's married and settled down. He runs his own professional business with his wife. It's been over 20 years since his time at S4. Conveniently, a man named Jeremy was also doing an independent film series about the UFO phenomenon. And over the years, some of the people he's been in contact with have been acquaintances of Lazar, mainly John Lear and George Knapp. Jeremy, being a longtime believer in Lazar's story, gets Knapp to introduce them to each other. And surprisingly enough, Lazar confides in Jeremy. Together, they're going to bring Bob's story to a new generation. So they meet each other and start talking. And the unbelievable happens. Bob and his business was raided once again.
Is the government watching you, Bob?
I didn't think they were after 30 years, but due to recent events, I would probably change.
What happened?
Jeremy and I had a private conversation out in a remote area of my property. Cell phones in our pockets, but turned off.
All filmed.
And filming it, and Jeremy was down there to film some of this documentary. He left the following morning, and simultaneously there was an FBI raid.
Apparently Jeremy and Bob had a conversation on the 18th that caused the FBI to raid his business. The conversation Jeremy and Bob had was taped for safekeeping, but from what was revealed in the recent documentary, it was in regards to the mysterious Element 115 and whether or not Bob took some home with him from the base when he left in 1989. And the government raid was them looking for it. Luckily, Bob and Jeremy were one step ahead of them. The taped conversation that caused the raid will in the end protect them from any repercussions and keep them safe. That, my friends, is the story of Bob Lazar, taken right from his mouth and the people that know him the best. Most believe he's one of the only actual reputable people that tie into the UFO phenomenon. Many people believe his sensational story, even those that are not balls deep in alien lore. Look at him like an honest man who has no reason to lie. He seems down to earth and believable. He has thousands of supporters and even world-renowned journalists vouch for him. He's told part of his story on Larry King and even been featured on the History Channel and Discovery Channel. Even on YouTube, one of the most skeptical places on earth, everyone welcomes his story with open arms. Even Joe Rogan let his inner fanboy take over when he interviewed Bob.
I mean, what I've gotten out of here is what I thought I was going to get out of here when I watched the documentary. That what you're saying makes sense. It doesn't make sense that it's bullshit.
That happened exactly like I said it did, Joe.
I believe you.
Christ, that was almost me. So like I mentioned at the beginning, I had a hard time with this video. I almost believed it. The inner science fiction nerd in me wanted to believe it. I've heard Bob's story years ago and he always seemed believable. And there was a surprising amount of evidence that added believability to his claims. Things like his ID badge, his pay stub from the Naval Department, his background interest in propulsion, his missing personal records, his knowledge of Element 115, he has footage of test flights, and even knowledge of early biometrics used by the base. All at face value make you want to believe his story. That was my personal way of looking into this going into Jeremy's new documentary. I was curious to know more. I seen the Lazar tape as a kid, and what I've seen from on TV growing up, the stories always seemed interesting to me. I also heard about the raid during filming also. It was a pretty big hit on Reddit for a bit. People were throwing all kinds of theories around. The police record was even obtained, and it was implying that Bob's business might have sold material that was used in another poisoning that took place in 2015. And the FBI's reason for searching was for sale records. Pretty convenient that this happened during the middle of filming. So my interest was kind of piqued and I sat down and watched the new documentary from Jeremy. And within minutes, something happened. Something unexpected. Well, two things actually. First, I laughed my ass off when I heard the Mickey Rourke narration.
Everything around us is a mental construct. We create our own reality.
That was way too much for me to handle. But no, seriously, one of the first main scenes shows Jeremy and Bob exchanging texts right after the raid. When I seen this, like a little flip switched. If that raid was caused by the conversation they had the previous day like they're claiming, then why would the FBI be planning it 2 days prior? The raid was planned before they even had that conversation. It was going to happen regardless of whatever they did in the bush. Wait, what? Like they couldn't even wait 10 minutes to start lying. And from one thing I've learned from my time on this platform is when there's smoke, there's fire. And I wasn't looking at this like I usually would. And with that, the illusion was shattered. This is the kind of shit that would not fly with YouTubers. Why are we letting this go with mainstream productions? On a side note, Jeremy is fucking lazy. He fucked up the dates on that phone so bad. That text message was sent from the future. Jeremy, that's fucking deceitful, bro. See, to me and many others, Bob's apparent honesty is one of his most redeeming qualities. Now they're lying about a timeline to fit a narrative. That's a sociopathic YouTuber thing. Now we're in my domain. So I took off my fanboy goggles and I looked at this like I would if Bob was a YouTuber. So I started digging and I found some pretty interesting things. Well, a lot of things that tell quite a different story from the mainstream one here. The first thing I took a hard look at was the raids around United Nuclear over the last 20 years. There's been 2 of them. The raid during filming, which is in connection to a poisoning, had nothing to do with Bob and Jeremy's conversation. Then there was a raid in the mid-2000s when Bob says the FBI was trying to connect him to a spy who was killed. Well, I found an article that says they were arrested and raided for selling illegal fireworks and combustible material. That makes a lot more sense than the spy story, considering we know Bob has a propensity to blow things up and is a fireworks junkie. George Knapp will tell you himself.
You look at him, you know, his house, he would fly a pirate flag over his house. He raced jet cars, have these gigantic jet cars in his front yard. He liked hookers, prostitutes. He liked machine guns. He's a very unconventional guy, someone who, you got to figure, I wouldn't give him a security clearance.
One of my favorite George clips I found, by the way. See, if I'm going to say some guy's story is starting to look like complete bullshit, the onus is on me to provide the proof. I can't just throw down my version of a story without debunking his. I told you, I was going to be thorough here. I have to be fair for the hardcore Bob believers. I was almost one of them. They'll be quick to point out the mysterious events surrounding Bob. And by mysterious, I mean misunderstood. First off, the big stuff. Element 115 and its associated properties. According to Bob and his supporters, in 1989 he was one of the first people to ever mention Element 115 and the potential for it to become a stable element, which would have been quite impressive considering the recent discoveries around it. But in reality, Bob wasn't actually the first person to mention it. There was a paper 2 years earlier that talked about the exact same thing he mentions, minus the alien UFO shit. Bob's main hobbies are fireworks and chemistry. It's not out of the realm of possibility to believe he or someone close to him had seen this paper before. Another point of contention was his missing personal records and schooling credentials. Well, in the early days when people were fact-checking Bob's story, they were going by government documentation, and one thing that was discovered was Bob was giving everyone the wrong SIN number. Yeah, the one he was giving the independent researchers was for a woman in New York. His birth certificate could also be explained. The person who looked into the hospital where Bob was supposedly born was George Knapp. He did the fact checking himself. There were no other investigators in Bob's camp, just George. Anyway, the reason why George had trouble finding records of Lazar's birth was because he was looking in the wrong place. Or didn't look at all, I'm not sure. Lazar came out years later and said he was adopted out of state. So at the time, the hospital he was actually born at was unknown. And as of now, Bob actually has all of his IDs, so they didn't erase him completely, just for a little bit. And as far as schooling goes, Stanton Friedman, another one of the ufologists with real-life master's degrees, used his connections and looked into Lazar's schooling. He couldn't find a thing. He even looked through yearbooks from 1977 to 1983. He sought out thesis papers, nothing. He couldn't find a thing. Another point of contention is the amount of people that vouch for Bob's story. Bob's three main supporters over the years have been George Knapp, Gene Huff, and John Lear, along with a fellow named Jim who actually worked at Los Alamos National Lab, but Jim stays away from all the alien shit completely. According to all parties involved, George, Gene, John, and Bob, they were all brought together to tell Bob's story in 88 and 89. Except for the fact that they actually knew each other before that. See, this isn't a very well-known fact, and I think I'm the first person to actually really tie it into Bob's story, but it's infinitely important. See, they were all friends that took part in this weird event in Nevada called Desert Blast. Here's a news clip of it. I bet you can't guess which news anchor got the scoop.
Quite simply, there is no other event like this in the world. It happens on different dates in different places in the Nevada desert. From all over the world, fireworks experts, gun nuts, rocket scientists, and daredevil pilots gather in relative secrecy to have fun and show off. You have to know someone to get invited. Once you do, you'll never forget it. The arrival begins slowly, a trickle of trucks or RVs slipping into the desert for a one-day pyrotechnical orgy. The trickle becomes a torrent until a few hundred of the hardcore are gathered at the dry lake bed to pursue mutual interests. Daylight hours are devoted mostly to guns of all varieties, 50 caliber machine guns ripping off rounds at a mountain a mile away. An assortment of cannons and howitzers blasting away at unseen enemies.
Fire in the hole!
What home should be without one of these? Or how about a mortar that fires bowling balls? Overhead, vintage planes buzz the lake bed. Rockets are fired off in bunches. Back on the ground, people zip around in bizarre contraptions. When did you last see someone in a motorized lawn chair carrying a submachine gun? Some of the fireworks are homemade, some are commercial products. Once the bombardment begins, it continues unabated for hours and hours, and includes far more displays than any 4th of July show you've ever seen. There are other evening attractions, including a competition for Miss Desert Blast, where contestants display their love of machine guns. The most chic way to get around the lake at night is by jet-powered go-kart. And thank goodness someone remembered to bring a flamethrower.
It's funny, George doesn't mention them by name, but he alludes to who they are. Real estate agent, that's Gene Huff. Pilot, John Lear. Scientist, that's Bob. There's an entertaining article from Wired written in 1994 about it. And the interviewer actually got a chance to talk to the founder of the event. That's Bob Lazar, our Bob. He's the founder of this event, and he gave a little rundown of the history. Apparently, Bob and a bunch of his friends would drive out to the desert, Nevada, blast off a bunch of homemade fireworks and bombs, plus a jet car, flamethrower here and there, maybe a plane.
We don't know who this guy was, but he strapped piles of fireworks to his person and then lit himself on fire.
Look out!
Fun stuff. No, but for real, Bob was bringing people out there in 85 and 86, and by 87 he was throwing private parties and shows. By 88 it was an annual thing, and it looks like a pretty big event. This is good though because it leads us to the next point, and that's Bob's supposed UFO footage in their test flights. Bear in mind, I've scoured the internet. I've looked over more footage and documentaries than I care for, like 45 gigs worth of shit, and the only time you see supposed footage of a UFO is right here. March 22nd, the first night, March 28th, the second night. There's no footage of the third visit because apparently they got arrested, which there's also no record of. But as far as actual test flight footage goes, that's it. Those are the only clips with a hard-coded date from Bob. When they play his montage and talk about footage, they often slide in other similar clips, but if you look for the dates, you can tell there's only those two. That's the famous flight test footage, and that proves nothing. We don't even know exactly where that is. We have what they claim, but we don't know what we're watching. We don't know if they're testing fireworks or some shit. Maybe it's a plane. It's not proof at all. Especially when these guys have lied about knowing each other prior and are known for messing around the desert with fireworks and shit. So that doesn't cut it anymore. Lastly, his ID badge and pay stub from the Naval Defense Department. Bob actually came forth and clarified that the picture of his ID was a composite, meaning fake. How did he fake it back then? Well, the man did own a photo processing business a few years ago. And as far as the validity of the pay stub, well, at the time, the name of the department was wrong. And the only thing right about it was the postal code. That's it. People consider this valid because the postal code matches. Forget the fact it's 88 and 89, which is weird. Usually you get one for 88 and a separate one for 89. I don't know though. But the department's wrong, and when they were contacted, the only thing they could verify was that the postal code was right. That's it. It's like the OG Pate bin, 100% fake. Anyway, the only thing Bob has to his name is actually working at Los Alamos National Lab in 1982. And he didn't even work for the lab, he worked as a contractor through Kirk Meyer in the lab. And I bet his friend Jim got him that job as a lab assistant or technician. I should bring up a couple weird inconsistencies I've noticed. One of the funnier ones is in regard to the brothel bust in 1990. There's Gene's version, which is that Lazar was a broken man whose life was falling apart. So he called up a hooker one night and ended up staying with her a little bit longer than expected. He set up a brothel with her, and eventually he was busted for speaking about it on TV during one of his interviews. The reason why he was busted was because Tony was an informant and Bob was blowing the cover for the whole operation. Then there's George's version, similar but different.
I called the cops. I let some people know, look, he made a mistake. It's being shut down. They raided the place, arrested Bob.
That's George covering his ass. Finding Bob's version is tough. He doesn't talk about it that much, and when he does, he's very vague. I've only found transcripts, but it's basically the same thing Gene says, minus the fun stuff. He says he was just friends with the hooker, totally non-physical. Yeah, okay. Bob claims in 1990 he bumped into a woman he knew in his days of running his own personal brothel called the Honeysuckle Ranch Lotion and Massage Parlor in the mid-1980s. For those counting, that's a different brothel from the one he was eventually busted at. I know, this story has a surprisingly large amount of pimp houses. Anyway, after finding out she was in the business, he helped her install some cameras and set up a computer system. That's it. It's funny how everyone has their own little versions. What's even funnier is the real version of events. So this is an article added to a magazine, archived on the internet as a PDF. Yeah, I went that deep. It was wrote after said trial. And while it says Bob and his girlfriend Tony, who was a known prostitute in the area, rented 2 apartments next to each other, and drilled a hole in one so people can come in one apartment, get a little rub and tug, and then leave through the other apartment. I know you're thinking, what is going on here? Anyway, They were also recording customers' license plates in the parking lot. They took their picture when they came in, and they also had the workrooms bugged. Bob's a bit of a freak. Don't read ahead in this article. We're actually going to come back to it in a little bit. See, as I take you through this journey I went through researching this, I have to be honest with you. I'm not looking at this UFO related at all any longer. To me, at this point, Bob's story is all bullshit, and I just want to get to the bottom of it. I don't need to go into the exact details of his apparent shifts or his time at S4 because it's all made up. And you'll understand why when I give you my version of his timeline at the end, the Dank Lazar timeline. I will touch on S4 briefly though. As far as the base is concerned, one thing that stands out to me is the fact that he claimed S4 was a flight bay on the side of a mountain off Groom Lake. And he was hired after the scientists died from an explosion working on a reactor there. A low-yield nuclear explosion in a hangar bay. See where I'm going with this? Doesn't make any sense. Like the whole mountain would be gone, not to mention the entire facility. I think someone might have noticed a nuclear explosion taking out half of Groom Lake, so that's all bogus. To me, another point of contention is Bob's actual knowledge base in physics. I'm not smart enough or educated enough to really talk about physics. Like I could sit here and pull a blaha and read shit off Google about gravity waves for an hour, but it's pointless. And people get hung up on the details too much. See, focusing on one aspect like the ship and trying to debunk what he says is a waste of time. Let's say Bob's story is a house. You're taking it apart brick by brick, when you could just take the whole thing down by proving the story as a whole was a lie from the get-go. Why focus on one small lie when the whole thing is a lie? Like the circumstances surrounding the dentist interview and how that came about. One story is Bob sought out George Knapp because he was scared. Another is that Bob just filled in for someone who canceled.
But 25 years ago, young anchor woman named Paula Francis and I were prepping for the 5 o'clock news when we learned that our scheduled live interview had canceled. We placed a call to aviator John Lear to ask if he could get a friend of his to fill the spot, a guy who reportedly worked out near Area 51 and had seen flying saucers out there. It sounded outrageous at the time, but that interview with Bob Lazar turned Area 51 upside down.
That really should be enough right there. But alas, I understand others don't look at it like the way I do and are actually interested in the scientific aspect of this. One of the independent researchers is named Tom Mahood. He's the guy I mentioned that went back to university to actually get a grounded understanding in physics so he could take a shot at Bob's claims. And he claims Bob's physics are complete bullshit. He's got an old website if you're interested in seeing an educated person's take. I'll link it with everything else. Tom spent about 4 to 5 years looking into Bob's early days, and then he got bored and moved on. He was able to pull out a lot of pretty interesting information considering it was the early 90s. It's funny going through all these old archives because you get a glimpse at how these guys used to share info back then. Fucking fax machine and snail mail. Glorious. Anyway, Tom was in a position where he was able to do his own investigation on Lazar, and he was able to pull out a bunch of pretty interesting things through Freedom of Information Acts. You gotta remember, people were taking this really serious. There were a handful of independent researchers looking this up, and even though they did miss a few things like Desert Blast, Tom and a few others' research, in a sense, built the groundwork for my research. So I'm impressed. But I was somewhat skeptical. Researching this topic has really made me realize it's important to understand where people get their information from and who exactly it is that information is coming from. But Tom does cite his sources like a professional, and the website as a whole was confirmed by Gene Huff, one of Bob's main guys. Gene Huff even responded to Tom's website. He did his best to fill in the blanks and keep the story still believable. Gene's screenwriting ability is at its all-time high right here. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I'm going to be using some of Tom's info to fill in the blanks for us. And Tom's timeline is factual and built strictly off of Freedom of Information Acts, news articles, and published interviews. No hearsay here, the man brought the facts. Some of it might be a bit shocking, but this is all public information. It's been on the web on a handful of websites for over 20 years. Bob and his party have acknowledged it and are fully aware this information is out there. So with that said, let's get to the bottom of this shit and tell the real story for the next generation. Here's the Dank Lazar timeline. So Bob was born in January 1959. In 1976, Bob attended Los Angeles Pierce College. In 1978, Bob claims he got a bachelor's degree of science in physics and electronics from Pacifica University, which is a correspondence university, and it was eventually shut down for selling degrees. He also claims that this is the time he went to Caltech. There was no record of that, zero. 2 years later, in 1980, Bob married his first wife, Carol. He was 21, she was 34. They lived in California at the time. 1982, Bob and Carol moved to Los Alamos. And a month later, Bob was featured in the newspaper with his jet car. I'm assuming he was working at the lab under contract at this time. That's why he was in the phone book. Either way, it didn't last long. Bob and his wife Carol ended up opening a small business to process photos from 1982 to 1985. This is when they met Gene Huff. A lot happened in 85. So Bob borrowed a lot of money, and him and Carol bought a house in Las Vegas. Bob lived in Los Alamos, Carol lived in Las Vegas. Bob could have been doing the Photoshop alone. Gene says he met Bob's second wife Tracy while she was working for Bob at the Photoshop. So maybe Bob hired someone to help him when Carol moved to Las Vegas. Coincidentally, that person he hired ended up being his next wife Tracy. Also, this is when Bob apparently invested in a brothel. Remember the Honeysuckle Ranch? Well, this is when that started, and it was located in Los Alamos and shut down for illegal prostitution. Gene also confirms that Bob and Tracy met in Los Alamos. I don't think it had anything to do with the Photoshop though. I think the Photoshop ended when Carol left for Las Vegas. The only thing I know is Bob starts dating Tracy in 85, and they're out there doing crazy shit in the desert with jet cars, guns, and John Lear. That's the trifecta of manliness. Jokes aside, the main reason I think he met Tracy in 85 is because he married her in 86, so he had to have known her before marrying her. Wait, I thought he was still married to Carol. You're smart. We'll get to that. So Saturday, April 19th, 1986. Bob and Tracy leave Los Alamos, go to Las Vegas, and get married. Yeah, really weird if you ask me, seeing as he's still married to Carol. What's even weirder is that on April 21st, Carol was found dead in her garage in Las Vegas from an apparent carbon monoxide poisoning. There was no autopsy, and her death was ruled a suicide. Within a week, Bob and Tracy make the permanent move from Los Alamos to Las Vegas, and they move right into the house Carol was found dead in. Wow. I know, that's quite a bit to process. Let's just let it stew for a second and continue. So a few months later, in July, Bob files for bankruptcy. He filed the Chapter 7, which is liquidation, and his reasons were loss of business and death of spouse, i.e. the Photoshop he ran with Carol and, well, Carol. He also had $15,000 unaccounted for, which he claimed his accountant stole. Even weirder, in October, in the middle of the bankruptcy process, Bob and Tracy remarried for a second time. This time though, Tracy used a different name, Strange. The next year, 1987, Bob's bankruptcy was finalized, with him having about $100K in assets from his Photoshop and owing about $200K in previous debt. The next year in 88, Desert Blast was officially open to the public. This is when John Lear says they met. I say he met Bob before, most likely in 87 or 86, while Desert Blast was still a private gathering. So March 16th, 1988, Bob and Tracy receive a notice of default for their house. They didn't pay any mortgage for over a year. Then on March 22nd, 6 days later, Tracy goes and buys a house under her other name, Jackie, the name she got married to Bob under the second time with. Bob quitclaimed the house, which gives all the ownership to her. I don't know the legality of this, but I think there may be some issues going on here. It seems to me the reason Tracy remarried as Jackie is so she's not linked to the time before Bob filed bankruptcy. It's very weird. He filed on July 21st, 1986. That was after he was married to Tracy the first time, and after his first wife Carol died. I'm not familiar with the bankruptcy process, but I bet it'd be pretty hard to explain to the courts that you're filing for bankruptcy and citing loss of spouse as the reason why, when in fact you're married to two different people at the same time. Bob also went under oath and said that he was not engaged in any other relationships, meaning he lied about his marriage to Tracy at the time, under oath, and then he married her again under a different name after the bankruptcy started. So she has no connection to that time of his life as a result of the second marriage. The bankruptcy courts wouldn't have known about the first marriage because that didn't come to light till the 1990s when Tom was filing his Freedom of Information Acts. Any way you look at it, that's pretty sketchy. Anyway, by December of 88 is when Bob supposedly got hired at S4. Bob's shifts at S4 are really strange. Initially he claims to have worked on and off for 6 months. He never really specified at first. It wasn't until he got hypnotized that he was able to reveal a lot of the information. Bob and Gene stated that Bob worked a total of 6 shifts between December of 88 and April of 89. Said his first trip out to S4 he spent signing security papers and taking an allergy test. The test almost killed him, by the way.
You just reminded me of something. When was that, Gene? When, was it right after that where I collapsed from the kidney?
Oh.
You remember that? And
right.
Was that there or after I had left the project?
No, you were still in the project.
That was right after that.
Right after they did these tests and gave him a shot.
You know, it's kind of surprising. I forget that.
Took a strange substance, and
all I remember is that you were at a Toyota dealer or something like that,
and he was in such pain. His kidneys hurt so bad he thought he was going to die. And to that point, Bob had never had any health problems or had never had any sedatives or painkillers, and the doctor gave Bob a shot of Demerol. And I called him, and he was floating on cloud 9. It wasn't even coherent, and I came to his house to see what was wrong, and then he was literally high from a painkiller they gave him just so he could stand the pain in his kidneys. So whatever went through his system certainly stuck there.
Yeah, so there was an adverse reaction to something.
Do you think that was, well, of course you have no way of knowing whether it was the allergy test they put you through or the shot they gave you?
Or wasn't it an amazing coincidence that,
but he had no prior kidney
or
problems.
something. Yeah, I mean, it is,
Well, I take it you went to the doctor.
I did, yeah.
What did he say?
I don't remember. I think he said he gave me a shot of painkiller, Demerol, I believe it was, and he took a urine sample, a blood test, and he asked if I had any previous problems, anything strange, and obviously I said no. Certainly didn't mention anything about getting an injection at a strange place in the middle of the desert.
Right.
Didn't they do X-rays or a CAT scan or something and
Not
find
a CAT scan. They did
kidney stones?
they did just an X-ray to see if there was any blockage, but
there was
a day later, or I think even the next morning, everything was fine. The X-rays came back negative, and I believe the blood work came back negative too, as did the urine sample.
There's no record of that. The second day, he read briefings. Third day, he's brought to S4 and shown around. Fourth day, he was shown a small test flight. The fifth day, he was shown inside the craft and the reactor. And these shifts took place between December 88 and March 89. In March of 89, conveniently around the time of Desert Blast, George and Bob started their interview process. This is when Bob started taking people out to show them the UFOs. There's the first trip on March 22nd and the second trip March 28th. No footage for the third trip, April 5th. This time they got arrested. Like I said, there was no record of that. And April 7th was apparently Bob's last shift. And they pulled him in, threatened his life, and told him that Tracy was fucking around on him. The story is different depending on who tells it. One version is that they showed Bob transcripts of Tracy and her new boyfriend talking. Another version is that Bob was shown transcripts of Tracy talking to her mom. Either way, it's bullshit. Bob and Tracy did eventually break up around the time he appeared in the first interview with George under the name Dennis. They also recorded the other interview at the same time and sat on it for months without airing.
We did that interview in Silhouette.
I can't quite remember how that happened. There was just too much going on. But yeah, I know at some point, and that was really, again, Lear was making a big deal. He started naming off the people that he knew that suddenly disappeared, and he said, unless you talk to this guy, George Knapp, and if you go out on the air, they'll be afraid to talk to you. I said, John, they're not afraid to do anything, but I called you anyway, or he did.
And then it kind of hits the fan. They're really mad at him, and then that's when a lot of really bad stuff started happening. And then we decided to record an interview just for safekeeping in case something happened to him. So it was a couple of hours on tape, and I, under the condition that I wouldn't use that until Bob said okay. And it was 8 months. 8 months until we got the okay, and I worked on him every day to talk him into allowing me to use it and tell the story, assuming he was still alive. And on the day that we were ready to broadcast it, it was part 6 of a 9-part report. Bob suddenly changes his mind and grabs the videotape.
Well, because you were going to say who I was, yeah.
Yeah, we're getting ready to identify him. We're 10 minutes from going on the air. We're wrestling over the tape. He did. As a UFO profiteer and messiah coming forward and making up stories, he was a very reluctant witness, I can tell you.
So much for George fact-checking anything. They taped these two interviews around the exact same time and aired them months apart to maximize on the effect. Bob's second interview was the main piece for George's UFO Expo. In December of '89, after the second interview, Bob was kind of a local star, and he did several appearances on Billy Goodman's The Happening radio show. Those were call-in shows. Bob was also offered an exclusive deal with a TV network in Japan during December of 1989. They gave him $5,000 and paid for his tickets to fly to Japan. What did he do? He bailed and took the cash. Said it was because he was scared for his life. In reality, I think it's because him and Gene and George were holding out for better prospects. As we slide into 1990, Bob was somewhat famous now, separated from his second wife Tracy, living in Las Vegas. June 5th is when he was arrested for pimping. His little setup with Tony was already established when they got caught. I think he was dating Tony, or at least seeing her well before they got caught. Remember, they had to meet, get another apartment, come up with this plan, and then set up the surveillance system, drill a hole through the wall, the whole shebang. I think that's why him and Tracy ended. I could be wrong, and it doesn't really do much regardless, but I think he was doing this shit with Tony in 1989 when he was doing his initial interviews and setting the stage for the Lazar tape. George said he knew about this stuff when the second interview was filmed, which was around the same time as the Dennis interview. George had taped that long before and just sat on it. I bet that's why Tracy left. Bob was banging hookers. In the end, Bob was sentenced in August and received 6 months probation, had to go see a therapist for his brothel addiction. I'm assuming the majority of the Lazar tape was filmed and finished at this time, because after Bob's court shit went down, they released it, and people ate it right up. Lazar would spend the next few years living off the capital he made off the production. He likes to say he hasn't made anything off it, but that's straight up retarded. He took Nippon, the Japan TV company, for $5,000 without a second thought. Bob is 100% an opportunist, and I don't see him doing this unless there's incentive. Either way, he eventually opened up his own business, United Nuclear. United Nuclear sells a lot of exotic materials to various labs and organizations. He also sold a lot of materials so people could make their own fireworks. Remember, he was the founder of Desert Blast. He also remarried once again. He would make appearances at conventions and even follow-up interviews for websites and books. For someone who apparently shies away from the UFO phenomenon, there's a lot of shit he's involved in. The next big event was in 2003 when Bob's business was raided for selling hazardous material to the public. Illegal fireworks, blasting caps, fuses, things like that. In 2007, him and his wife were sentenced to 3 years probation and fined $7,500. Fast track a few more years and Jeremy comes into the picture. Jeremy knows both George and John Lear. That's how Bob was introduced to him. Jeremy started a whole series and website dedicated to UFO stuff, and Jeremy really reminds me a lot of Tom DeLonge. They're taking everything UFO related, throwing it against the wall, and hoping something sticks. So far, no dice. Anyway, in December of 2015, a woman died of thalmine poisoning. 9 months later, in August of 2016, a man in Michigan also died of thalmine poisoning. Thalmine is not easy to come by, and Bob's business is one of the only places where you can purchase that kind of stuff online. So the FBI got a search warrant for his business, and they got sale records of people who bought thalmine. It had nothing to do with Jeremy or the documentary, zero. And that brings us to now, where years have passed, the people who know Bob's full of shit have moved on, and Jeremy is introducing Bob's story to a new generation. So I know that's a lot of information to take in, but when I go down one of these rabbit holes, I bring the backhoe, and I have to lay it all out for you guys. This is one of those videos where I don't want you to necessarily take my opinions I've stated throughout the video as anything like facts. Take the facts I've shown you and discern your own opinions. I'm just telling you as someone who thought there was some believability to Bob's claims, as retarded as that sounds now in retrospect, but in no way can I say that at this time. Knowing that Bob, Gene, and John all knew each other in the early Desert Blast days before he was even at S4 makes me believe they all concocted this story and used their connections with George Knapp to produce everything from the Dennis interview all the way to the Lazar tape. And it came together when George's original fake interviewer didn't show up. George even admits on the news that when he was filming the original Dennis interview, the guy was planned to play the part didn't show up, and John Lear hooked him up with Bob.
Francis and I were prepping for the 5 o'clock news when we learned that our scheduled live interview had canceled. We placed a call to aviator John Lear to ask if he could get a friend of his to fill the spot.
Like, it's so clear to me now that this whole thing was just a money grab that blew up. And these 4 guys fabricated this story and used George's position to blow it up. But it worked better than they thought. And now George's reputation is tied to Bob's story. So they had to make it believable, hence all the theatrics, the setup lie detector tests, hypnotist sessions. It's all bullshit. They even implied that Bob was drugged and couldn't remember anything from S4. He was never there, and the footage he has could have been shot from any location in the Nevada desert. These guys were all over there shooting fireworks with guns and hookers before the whole UFO thing even came out. And Jeremy is just keeping the torch going by spinning the narrative to fit his story. And Joe Rogan, what the fuck happened with your interview with Bob? Did you even take a look into this?
But the idea of skeptics, the problem with that is you're always looking for things to be bullshit.
Yeah.
And I think that's dangerous because I think some things aren't bullshit.
It's confirmation bias on the other end. You're just deciding to take a square thing and put it in a round hole no matter what.
And I find a lot of them to be lazy.
Yeah.
A lot of them to be lazy thinkers.
Joe had the position to actually try and squeeze the truth out of Bob, and he spent 2 hours sucking his dick. Joe could have drilled him on the brothel bust, any of the raids. Nope, nothing. Just basically spoon-fed Bob his own story. For anyone still on the fence about the validity of Bob, let's just have a little thought experiment here to finish things up. Let's say Bob was right, and he blew the top off S4, and the government wanted to shut him down. Parts of the government so powerful and secretive that they make the CIA look like Ontario cops. A government that probably has made people disappear in the past. Why would that same government mess around with his personal records of schooling? Why would the most powerful force in the government waste time printing transcripts of his wife's affair? Think about what's happened to Julian Assange. If the government wanted to get rid of Bob at any time, they simply could have and most definitely would have. And they don't even need a cover up either. If they wanted to get rid of Bob, all they'd have to do is go back and reopen that case on Carol's death. One call is all it would take, They'd reopen that shit cold case style. The government doesn't even have to do it. The FBI could do it on their own. And if they wanted to get rid of Bob, they'd frame him and pin him to the wall. Kill all credibility he has, literally seize everything down to the last firework, and drop his ass in some black hole in the middle of nowhere. That's what would happen if Bob's story was true. Again, guys, I know how that may have sounded, but I'm not saying Bob had something malicious to do with Carol's suicide. I'm not saying that. That would be irresponsible of me. But then again, I'm not going to sit on the fence and lie to you. It's weird that Bob went to Las Vegas, married his wife while still married to Carol. It's even weirder that Carol was found dead 2 days later and Bob only benefited from it. He got her house, he moved in within a week, and he was able to liquefy all the assets from the photo business in Los Alamos via bankruptcy and start a brand new life with Tracy in Las Vegas. Don't get your pitchforks or anything though. If a dumb fucking Canuck like me can see the weirdness and possible motive in this, I'm pretty sure someone else is capable of noticing. It would be completely naive of me to assume I'm the only one that thought this was weird going through it. And just because this stuff isn't well known, I'm pretty sure smarter people than me have looked into it. So if there was something malicious surrounding this event, it probably would have come out by now. At least I hope. The only thing I can say for certain is that that series of events shows you just how cold and calculated an opportunist Bob really is. And that's more telling than any interview or podcast you could ever see. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this convoluted shit show. Tell me what you think down below, and I'll see you guys next upload.
Help at one point in my discussions privately with General Secretary Gorbachev, when you stop to think that we're all God's children, wherever we may live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together. Well, I don't suppose we can wait for some alien race to come down and threaten us, but I think that between us we can bring about that realization. Thank you all. God bless you all.